Hello, it's Amy. I'm back once again with the memoir of the Princesse de Ligne, and we are beginning chapter 5 today. And just a refresher that this is the memoir of a young girl attending a Paris convent in the 18th century. When the retreat that followed the First Communion was ended, the chapter assembled in order to decide what should be the function assigned to each of the pupils recently admitted to the Holy Communion. It was an established custom at the Abbaye aux Bois for the pupils to perform the duties of the convent in its 9 different offices, which were the abbatial, the sacristy, the parlor, the dispensary, the linen department, the library, the refectory, the kitchen, and the community. A certain number of lay sisters were associated with them in these employments, which only occupied a limited number of hours, and did not interfere with accomplishments, but formed the greatest contrast with them as well as with the aristocratic names of the young ladies. Mesdemoiselles de la Roche-Aymon and de Montbarry could be seen carefully arranging the piles of napkins and sheets in the presses, while Mesdemoiselles de Chevigny and de Nantouillet laid the cloth. Mesdemoiselles de Beaumont and d'Armelay added up the accounts. Mademoiselle de Gouillon mended a chasuble. Mademoiselle de Bantonnet was on duty at the gate. Mademoiselle de Latour Maubourg gave out the sugar and the coffee. Mesdemoiselles de Talleyrand and de Duras were at the orders of the community. Mademoiselle de Voguet had a particular talent for cooking, and Mesdemoiselles du Zays and du Boulonvilliers superintended the sweeping of the dormitories under the direction of Madame de Bussy, irrelevantly nicknamed by the pupils La Mère Gralion. Finally, Mesdemoiselles de Saint-Simon and de Talmont were responsible for repairs, and Mesdemoiselles d'Harcourt, du Rohan Guméneret, de Brisac, and de Galard lighted the lamps under the supervision of Madame du Royaume, whom they called the Mother of Light. After having acted the part of Esther in a dress embroidered with diamonds and pearls worth 100,000 écus, an écu, E with an accent, CU was 5 shillings, says the footnote here. Helene returned to the convent and resumed her little black frock again, prepared decoctions and poultices in the dispensary. So Helene was apparently working in the dispensary. That's where she was assigned. Such an education may appear strange to us, but it unquestionably prepared. I'm stumbling over words today. It unquestionably prepared excellent housekeepers and accomplished women of the world. I was very anxious, Helene says, that we should not be separated and that we should be placed together in the dispensary. On the contrary, I was sent to the Abbey House and Mademoiselle de Choiseul to the record office. Mesdemoiselles de Conflans, who did not know how to hold a needle, were sent to the sacristy. And I don't know what a sacristy is, but it is Sacristy, and I'm assuming perhaps it has something to do with sewing or needlework, given that those 2 ladies didn't know how to hold a needle and were sent there. Perhaps it was there for them to learn, and perhaps it has something to do with the making of sacred garments or sacred cloths. We'll see if they explain that. That's one of those things where I wish there was a footnote, but there just isn't here. This made us very cross. However, if Mademoiselle de Choiseul had been with me, I should have been very happy at the Abbey House, where the Lady Abbess ruled with the greatest gentleness and justice. She had taken a great liking to me. She considered that I did her commissions with intelligence. I was quick, and when she rang, I was always the first to come. I knew her books, her papers, her work, and was always the one she sent to fetch what she required from her desk, her bookshelf, or her chiffonnier. Helene's companions at the Abbey House were apparently amiable, judging by the record she has left us. Mademoiselle du Chatillon, nicknamed Tatillon, busybody, 14 years old, serious, pedantic, very pretty, but rather stout. Madame Deveau, born a Bourbon, 12 years old, just married, very small, a pretty face, silly but good-natured. Mademoiselle de Mura, nicknamed La Precirise, the conceited, 18 years old, pretty, handsome, even witty, amiable, but rather pretentious. Mademoiselle du Lourdes, very pretty, quiet, gentle, not clever, was married the same year to the Duc d'Amberg. Mademoiselle de Manicamp, her sister, plain, kind, very intelligent, hasty, and passionate. I had become very intimate with Madame de Saint-Geroud and Madame Saint-Cyprin. They were together regular madcaps, fond of laughter and amusement. Mademoiselle de Manicamp was also a great addition to the society. Madame Deveau used to tell us so very frankly that she cordially detested her husband, and that we were always joking about it, and openly made fun of him whenever he came to see her, as, unfortunately for him, the windows of the abbess's apartment looked out on the yard, so that it was impossible for him to avoid our mischievous glances. Mademoiselle de Mormont was also on duty at the Abbey House, and her presence alone was sufficient to banish all dullness and melancholy. We laughed at the grand airs Madame de Torcy gave herself, and maintained that she had only become a nun because she had found in Jesus Christ alone a spouse worthy of her, and even then she was not quite sure she had not made a mésalliance. And there's no translation for that, but I'm assuming maybe it would roughly translate something along the lines of a mistake, a mess of things, or something like that. Madame de Romelin, all bristling over Greek and Latin, amused us also. We called her Aristotle's eldest daughter. This did not make her angry, as she was very good-natured. But our great delight was to establish the pretentious Murat at the harpsichord. Then she sang, and Madame de Saint Gertrude, who was extremely merry and an excellent mimic, stood behind her and imitated all her affectations. A great many people also came to ask for permits, or to speak to Madame de Royer, or to the Lady Abbess. This dissipation might suit a good many other people, but for my part I was rather bored by the functions at the Abbey House. I do not know why, but this fashion of dancing, attendance on others, seemed to me humiliating. It was the custom of the Abbé aux Bois to give a ball once a week during the carnival. On that day, says the young princess, we laid aside our school dress, and every mother decked out her daughter as well as she could. Our attire on these occasions was most elegant. A great many women of the world attended our balls, especially young married ladies, who, not being able to go out alone, preferred them to those of the fashionable world, or, as they were obliged to remain all the time, seated next to their mothers-in-law. It is evident that already at this period, a young married woman dreaded the tyranny of a mother-in-law, who indeed exercised a far greater authority over her than ever her own mother. The mother-in-law was alone privileged to accompany the young married woman in society. Probably it was reasonable enough to expect less indulgence on her part than on a mother's, and the husband preferred this safeguard, precluded as he was by custom and fear of exciting ridicule, from watching or even noticing his wife. We shall see that the supervision of the mother-in-law could ill be dispensed with for some of these giddy young women. One day, when Madame de Luynes and Madame de la Roche-Aymon were at the ball, they sent away their carriages and hid themselves in Mademoiselle de Mont's apartment. After the bell had been rung for silence, they began making the most horrible noise, which they kept up in the convent throughout the night. They broke all the pictures that are put outside the ladies' cells. They stopped all the nuns whom they met going to matins. In fact, they made the most diabolical noise. The Lady Abbess gave orders that these ladies should not be in any way insulted, but that they should be given no food and not be allowed to leave the convent. When 11 o'clock struck, they asked for something to eat, but they were refused. Then they requested that the gate should be opened, but Madame de Saint-Jacques, who was head portress, said that the keys were at the Lady Abbess's. They then sent Mademoiselle d'Aumont to beg the Lady Abbess to have the doors opened for them. The Lady Abbess sent them word that, having remained without her permission, they should not leave till their families came to fetch them away, upon which they were in despair. Madame de Rouchart, on the other hand, warned them to be careful when the pupils were going or returning from Mass or the refectory, as she could not answer for their not being insulted should they find themselves in their way. If the truth be known, they were most anxious to hoot them and turn them into derision. We were even ready to throw water at them. Meanwhile, Madame de la Roche-Aymon was expected to dinner at her uncle's, the Cardinal de la Roche-Aymon, and Madame la Duchesse de Chevreuse, on her side, was expecting her daughter-in-law, Madame la Duchesse de Lens. Their attendants said they had remained at the Abbaye aux Bois. Accordingly, their relations sent word that they were waiting for them, but the Lady Abbess wrote to Madame de Chevreuse and to the Cardinal that Mesdames de Lens and de la Roche-Aymon were not quite right in their heads, and that she would hand them over only to their relations. Madame de Chevreuse, in a state of anxiety, hurried to the abbey, when she soundly rated her daughter-in-law, and the two prisoners, very much annoyed at this adventure, were given into their charge. Mademoiselle d'Aumont excused herself by saying she was not aware that these ladies were hiding in her room, but there was every reason to believe she was implicated in the plot. A fine story occurred at another ball. Mademoiselle de Chevreuse found a note appointing a meeting, addressed to Madame la Viscountess de Laval, who had been at the ball and had dropped it. The note ran as follows: "You are adorable, my dear Viscountess. Trust in my discretion and my fidelity. Tomorrow at the same hour and in the same house." On finding this note, Mademoiselle de Chevreuse immediately read it and put it in her pocket. After the ball, she showed it to all the Red class. We could well imagine that it was a gentleman who wrote to her like that. The mistresses, hearing of it, insisted on having the note, and we believe it must have been returned to Madame de Laval, as she never came again to the convent for any of the carnival balls. There was much talk in Paris 2 years later concerning an affront sustained by Madame de Laval. Beaucamont mentions that Madame de Laval presented herself for the post of lady-in-waiting to Madame. It had been almost promised her, but she was refused it because her father, Monsieur de Boulogne, had been treasurer in the War Department, and therefore was not of gentle birth. Her father-in-law, Monsieur de Laval, first gentleman of the chamber to Monsieur, sent in his resignation. The whole family of the Montmorency made an outcry over it. Madame de Laval was the daughter of Monsieur de Boulogne, Fermer General, the tax gatherer, it says in a footnote, who for a certain sum leased out government collection of the taxes. From the anecdote related to the young princess, and from a certain account given in Lausanne's Memoirs, it seems probable that the alleged motive was only a pretext in order to avoid placing in attendance on Madame a person with such a reputation of heedlessness. And here we go. We have a heading titled The Sacristy. And so hopefully this is going to tell us exactly what we want to know about what the sacristy is and what Helene does in the sacristy. After having served 3 months in the Abbey House, I was sent to the sacristy or vestry department, where the company was very amusing. As for the duties, they did not suit me at all, for I have always had an incredible aversion to needlework. There were, at that time, some very agreeable persons employed in this department, amongst others, Mademoiselle de Broglie and Mademoiselle de Heroy, with whom I was very intimate, and Mademoiselle de Dufour, who was lively and very charming. Mademoiselle de Heroy was pretty, had a good figure, and played the harp like an angel. She was 12 years old. Mademoiselle de Broglie, a little older, was rather pretty and overflowing with wit. One may well say that all the gossip and all the news was chronicled in the sacristy. It was a general meeting place for the whole blessed day. If anyone was complaining or rejoicing or had some event to relate, it was always in the sacristy that they came. The 2 vestry nuns were Madame de Granville and Madame de Tenel. Madame de Granville wished to teach me to embroider, for she herself embroidered most beautifully, but she never succeeded in teaching me. I therefore did no work, but was employed in folding and cleaning the vestments and helping Madame de Saint Philippe to arrange the church. In the evenings, at least 20 persons came to talk about what had taken place in the four corners of the establishment, but I did not remain there, for I used to go to Madame de Rouchart's, where I always found Madame de Choiseul, Mesdemoiselles du Conflans, Madame de Saint Delphine, Madame de Saint Sulpice, Madame de Saint Edouard, and the best society. Madame de Saint Delphine, sister to Madame de Rochot, was generally stretched out with her feet upon a chair, beginning purses, of which she never finished one. I had much amusement in listening to her, for she was very droll, and though Madame de Rouchart's wit was more remarkable and striking, whereas Madame de Saint Delphine's was often languid like her person, yet when roused she was very agreeable. Moreover, it is well known that wit is hereditary in the Mortemar family. Madame de Saint Delphine was one of the prettiest women one could see. She was 26 years old, tall, with lovely fair hair, large blue eyes, and most beautiful teeth, charming features, a fine figure, and a noble carriage. She suffered a great deal from her chest, was of an indolent character, and entirely dominated by her sister. Madame de Saint Sulpice was pretty, lively, and amiable. Madame de Saint Edouard pretty, amiable, and very romantic. We talked as freely as we pleased, and whatever was said, I never saw Madame de Rouchart's grow warm in discussing any opinion. At the very utmost she would throw ridicule on the matter, a talent in which she excelled, and against which it was difficult to hold one's own. New works were read that could without inconvenience be read by us. We chatted about all that took place in Paris, for the ladies spent their days in the parlour, where they received the very best company, and the young ladies went out a great deal, so everything was known. It was rare at Madame de Rouchart's to hear anyone speak ill of their neighbours, and even then it was always much more vaguely than in any of the other sets in the convent. Yet her circle was the one most feared, for it was well known that everyone there was witty and superior to the rest. It was therefore looked upon as a kind of tribunal, whose criticism one dreaded to encounter. When on leaving Madame de Rochot I returned to the sacristy, Madame Saint Mathieu and Madame Saint Ursula used to ask me, "Well, what do those exquisites say about us?" "Nothing, madame," I would honestly reply. "They did not mention you." Then their astonishment was without end, for they themselves ran down the whole household all day long. I may say that Madame de Rochot, her sister Madame de Saint Sulpice, and several other ladies of their society, had an indifference amounting to contempt for anything that did not particularly concern them, and were always the last to become acquainted with the news of the convent. It seemed to me that Madame de Rochot and her sister had a style of their own and a manner that we all caught. I mean those of us whom she received. The women of the world were astonished at the style in which we expressed ourselves. Mademoiselle de Conflans especially never said anything like anyone else, and there was originality in her every word. Madame de Rouchart's society, the advice, full of tact and refinement, that she gave these young girls, admirably adapted them for the part they were destined to fill in the highest ranks of society. In our free and easy days we cannot have the faintest conception of what was formerly considered good style and courteous manners, nor of the value that was set on all the different shades of good breeding. Politeness, good taste, and style constituted a kind of truce that each one guarded with care, as if it had been confided to them only. Women especially were the chief supporters of this groundwork, of all the charms of society. I shall never forget what happened one day between me and Madame de Rouchart. She had told me to come to her cell in the evening, so I went and found her surrounded with papers, busily writing. I was not astonished, as she was in the habit of being so occupied, but what struck me was to see her look disconcerted and blush tremendously on my arrival. She told me to take a book and sit down. I therefore pretended to read and watched her. She wrote with great agitation, rubbed her forehead, sighed, and looked around her with a fixed and absent look, as if her thoughts were 100 leagues away. She often wrote like that for 3 consecutive hours. At the slightest sound she would give a start, which showed how absorbed she was, and seemed in a way almost angry at having been disturbed. On that day I so distinctly saw tears in her eyes that I could not help thinking that perhaps she was not happy. While pondering, I looked at her. She had a paper before her, pen in hand, her mouth half open. Her eyes looked fixedly before her while her tears were flowing. I was so deeply affected that tears gathered in my eyes, and I was unable to suppress a deep sigh. This aroused Madame de Rouchart, who raised her eyes, and seeing me in tears, immediately concluded I had noticed the state of anxiety she was in. She held out her hand to me in a most expressive and touching manner, saying, "Dear heart, what is the matter?" I kissed her hand and burst into tears. She questioned me again, and I confessed that the extreme agitation I had seen her in had led me to suppose that she was harboring some sorrow, and that this was the cause of my being so affected. Then she folded me in her arms and remained silent for a time, as though reflecting on what she would say. Then she said to me, "I was born with a very vivid imagination, and in order to employ it, I hurriedly set down on paper all that it conceives. As among these fancies many are sad and melancholy, they often affect me keenly enough to make me shed tears. Loneliness and a life of contemplation keeps up in me this propensity to give way to imagination." The supper bell rang while we were still talking. We parted with regret, and since then, Madame de Rouchart's tenderness towards me increased twofold, and nothing could equal the tender interest I felt for her in return. And that is the end of chapter 5. I think that's a very, very interesting passage that she ended on there, talking about how, this nun who spent her life in a convent, looking after young ladies, still has this very, very vivid imagination, and it's not quite clear what she was writing. Perhaps it was, poetry. Perhaps it was a diary or a journal of some sort. Perhaps it was even some form of a fictional novel or something along those lines. But I rather like how that passage ended with that sentiment there.